Hi, this is John from Sharp Mountain Games. And when I hear about people who are going to stop their games and are going to stop being a DM, it just breaks my heart. So for today, we're going to talk about some ways to thrive as a forever DM. So one thing I'm sure that people know about is that there's a shortage of Dungeon Masters. And for this video, I'm going to use the term Dungeon Master or DM just because we're so familiar with it. Although, of course, I mean Game Master or Narrator or whatever you prefer to use. But we hear that there's a shortage of DMs, especially for 5th edition. And there's no sugarcoating it. Being a Dungeon Master is a lot of work. And others have pointed out that especially with the most recent editions of Dungeons & Dragons, there are just so many player options in terms of classes and races or species, whichever term you prefer. And you just get so many combinations. It just puts an enormous burden on the Dungeon Master to know about all this. And it can make it extremely difficult to design challenging adventures with all these different player options. So those are just, I think, a few of the problems. But I don't want to be negative. Today what I want to do is talk about ways to thrive as a forever DM. So the first point, and there are 4, is run the system that you're comfortable with. Period. Full stop. If you find that 5th edition or Pathfinder or any particular game, if you find that rule set is too complex, don't run them. Run something you're much more familiar with. Now, I certainly have my own preferences. I prefer OSR and lighter systems. And I also find that lighter rules are much better if you're running for online play, especially if you have new players, people who are new to the game. It's easier if it's a simpler system and there's fewer stats for them to keep track of. Now, if you're saying, well, I really like 5e, sure, there's some simpler hacks of 5e available, or you can even cut some things out. Even the Dungeon Master's Guide itself suggests, hey, you could run this without feats. Hey, you could run this without skills. There's ways to cut things down. Now, I know what you're thinking, but if I change system, I'm going to lose all my players. All they want is 5e. But here's my question. Do they prefer 5e or no game at all? If you don't have a DM, you don't have a game. And again, maybe somebody else is willing to step up and be the Dungeon Master, but that's not always the case in many, many groups. So, is 5th edition and 5th edition by the book or Pathfinder by the book or whatever, is that so much of a purity test for folks? I would hope not. I would hope that people realize that the real fun is being with other people and, playing in the world, and that the dice and the rules, those are a little bit more incidental. I don't want to say they're not important, but, hopefully there's some flexibility for most people. So I think, simply it's very reasonable for a DM to say, hey, I need to run a different, simpler system, or I need to streamline this. It's getting too much for me. We all have probably work and family and other commitments, and I don't think it's unreasonable to say, hey, I can run this simpler system or I can run this different system because that's what I have the time and the energy to run, and that's kind of it. I think most players will understand that. Now, you may always have a small number of players, probably just 1 or 2, who they're not going to go for it, and they may even walk. I mean, we just have to be realistic. But I don't think you're going to find that it's most of your group. And, if that person is that much of a purity test and they walk, there's other players. There are other players, especially if you're running online. I don't think it's that impossible to find another player. Now, the second point I'd like to make is limit your character choices for the players. Now, Professor DM, in one of his videos, he explains that not all classes, races, or combinations will work in every game, and I absolutely second that. If you're trying to run a Tolkien-esque setting, and you have cat people and elephant people and rabbit people, that doesn't really fit in so much with that particular setting. So, and that's one reason to limit it. So one thought you might do is, you don't want to be, again, with all this, I don't want to say, well, the DM has to be, authoritarian in everything, but maybe you could have a list of saying, these are the classes, these are the races or species that are present in my world, and then let them pick and choose from that. It still gives the players at least some flexibility, but it also gives the DM some control over things, so it doesn't become this monstrosity that they can't handle. Another option is pre-gens. These are great for con games, especially for new players. If I'm running for new players, I have the choices already laid out before them, so that way I know what they are, and I tend to stick to the basics, wizard and halfling and things like that. If you want to limit it even more, you could consider going back to something like BX, where dwarf was a class and elf was a class. I know some people don't like that, but I don't think it's really all that bad, because you're not saying, oh, every dwarf is this way. They might have clerics or magic users as well, but these are the dwarves who tend to go on an adventure. It's an archetype, and if people have seen the Lord of the Rings movies, they kind of know how to play that sort of character or what they're getting into. So I don't think that that's awful, especially for new players or con games. So should you allow some exceptions? Sure, sometimes, but I would say not at the expense of making your job harder. If a player comes to me and says, I want to be a multi-class sorcerer, artificer, who's half tiefling and half genasi, I think it's very reasonable to say, I don't think that's going to work in my particular game or in our particular world. I don't think it's unreasonable to say no. Now, in my mind, I might be thinking something about special snowflakes, but we'll leave that for another day. I know people, maybe they want to try something new, so we should be a little bit open as dungeon masters, but not to the point that it's going to bomb the game or make it impossible to run. You have to just, again, it comes back to, and letting your group know, I'm one person. I have other commitments. I have to run something that's streamlined and as reasonable as possible while still giving you some choices. Now, here's another one, point 3, that I think is good for during the game. And that's to use genre conventions to your advantage, or to use the classes to your advantage. So that way you don't have to obsess about over exactly which skill to use or exactly which difficulty number you should set. You can simply say something like, Tolan, you're a wizard. You can tell these runes are magical and describe an ancient ritual. You've given them information, and I don't think you've taken away any agency from the player. In fact, you've kind of made them feel special. You've said, hey, there's something that your character class can do and your particular character can do that other people can't. Now, if you do want them to roll or they really like to roll, that's fine. But what I would say is pick the character who's most suited and have that person make the roll. Now, what this prevents is everybody at the table reaching for their dice, and they do what I call skill dogpiling. That term may not be original to me. But what they're doing is they're all rolling, and somebody's going to succeed. And a lot of times it's the person or the character who doesn't really make sense that they should be the one succeeding. The wizard shouldn't be tracking in the wilderness. I think it's much better to say, Reaper, you're a barbarian. You might be able to find some tracks because you're used to being out in the woods. Give me a wisdom roll. We didn't have to obsess over, is it a nature skill or is it this or that? I mean, you can if you want. But we've avoided a lot of the problems there, and we've still let the player make some choices, make some rolls, and feel special. Now, this doesn't mean you should be inflexible or not listen to your players. They might say, well, could I make a history roll? I have some history on my character sheet, and that's fine. However, the nature of the game really does mean that somebody's got to make these decisions, and that's the game master or the dungeon master. And number 4, I think in terms of thriving as a forever DM, and I'm a really big believer in this one, is don't be afraid to run a session or two of something else. I often ask myself, why is this hobby 90-95% fantasy? Why does it have to be? I mean, I love The Lord of the Rings, but those aren't the only type of books that I like to read. They're not the only type of TV shows that I like to watch. I like Star Trek, but I wouldn't only watch Star Trek. That's not good. That's not healthy. And in the same way, I don't think fantasy every single week is healthy. And quite honestly, sometimes I get tired of fantasy and I just need a break. I need something to break it up. Now, again, this can be scary too, because you're worried players are going to walk. They only want fantasy. They only want 5th edition. But again, you're not really here to beg people to stay. Let me just say that again. We're not here to beg players to stay. We want to encourage people and we want to be positive and have a good group, but I don't think we should be groveling as dungeon masters. I think you can simply say, hey, I need a break from the dungeons for a couple sessions. I'm going to run a Star Trek game, just for a couple sessions, or I'm going to run Star Wars or superheroes or a horror type game. Whatever, you'd really like to run and do something a little bit different. And, say everyone is welcome. If anybody wants to step back, they can come back in a couple of weeks when we go back to the regular stuff, when we go back to the regular story. And if somebody decides to sit out, that's fine. And I've even invited other people who I knew would enjoy it. Like I ran an alternate Star Trek game, and a couple players who didn't come for whatever reason. They may just have been busy also. And I knew somebody else who would really enjoy that, and they sat in and I think had a good time that game session. So, there's options. Now, this was an online game, so it was pretty easy to bring somebody else into the fold. Now, unless you're getting paid, unless you're somebody who's getting paid to do this every week, which is a different story altogether, then you're providing a service and maybe you have to run 5th edition or fantasy, or you have to run the same thing every week. But unless you're getting paid, your players really should cut you some slack. They should cut you some slack on the genre, and hopefully players, go along for a week or two. Maybe you're not crazy about a superhero genre or a science fiction genre, but hopefully they'll go along at least for a week or so. I really think Dungeon Masters are owed that. And that variety is really a form of self-care for the Dungeon Master. It really is. It's kind of a way to keep going long term. So let's bring this up and wrap this up to conclude it. DMs really shouldn't be too heavy-handed, or of course not railroading. But however, I think, if you're going to be a forever DM, you have to get used to setting some limitations on rules and classes and things like that in order that you can maintain some agency and that you can maintain some feeling of control over the situation so that you don't burn out. I mean, I just think that that's just the realistic thing. If you burn out, you're the DM, then there's no game unless someone else is willing to step up. So you need to keep it manageable in terms of those rules and character options, and certainly trying a new genre on occasion. I think that really helps our storytelling ability, or the way to think about presenting challenges and things. So the DM, if they do that sort of thing, they're far less likely to experience burnout. And when the DM doesn't burn out, the fun can go on, well, as long as you'd like, and maybe even forever. So if you liked the video, you can certainly hit like and subscribe. And if you stay tuned for just a couple more seconds, you can hear about some of the products from Sharp Mountain Games. And either way, we'll see you next time. So if you'd like to check out or purchase any of our products, we have 3 books that are in print: The Star Mermaid, The Dwarven Pickup Truck, and The Sky Tree. And the best place to get the print versions is through Amazon or Lulu. And also over on drive-thru, you can get the digital versions, or we have a number of other adventures and character classes and even some stock art available on drive-thru. And then on the Roll20 Marketplace, we have some map packs and also character cards for use. So wherever you like to shop, odds are we're there. And hopefully, we hope that you'll subscribe and like the video, and we'll see you next time.